Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Matthew. It's great to be here. I was in Istanbul a few months ago speaking at a conference of communications leaders around the globe, and it's great to be back and speaking to you people who are driving the economy. And I think what my talk this morning is going to be kind of an overview of where we are now, how we got to where we are, and where we might go from here. I think perhaps the most important thing to recognize about this time that we're in is it's a revolutionary time. This is perhaps the greatest revolution that human beings have ever experienced. I think our time today is more revolutionary than the agricultural revolution or the industrial revolution or any of the American or French or any of the other revolutions. We are at a time in history that is totally changing the way human beings look at ourselves. For the first time in human history, every human being on this planet, in fact, every sentient being, plants and animals, we're all facing the same crises for the first time. You know, it used to be that Japan, which we just saw on the boards here, had tsunamis, and there were earthquakes in San Francisco and many other places, but they didn't really impact each other that much. Today, we're all facing a crisis that I would call climate chaos. We know the glaciers are melting, the oceans are rising, whatever the cause is, it's happening. We're at a time when resources are diminishing at accelerating rates, and the prices of food and fuel and other essentials are increasing at accelerating rates. We're at a time of severe change, and for the first time in human history, for the very first time, we are all communicating with each other across this planet through the internet, cell phones, streaming. We're all talking to each other. This is brand new, and it's incredibly significant. And for the first time in human history, we have to recognize how terribly interconnected we are. I have a 4.5-year-old grandson who lives near me up in the forests of Washington State in the United States, and we go out walking in the woods frequently, and every time I'm with this 4-year-old, I think, what will this world look like in 6 decades when he's my age? And I think we all know that if we stay on this path, it's probably going to be pretty tragic. But we have the opportunity to change things, and you particularly, you are the drivers of the global economy. You are the people who decide where the money is going to go, who's going to get the money, what investors, what new technologies, what entrepreneurs, what corporations are going to be there to take care of my grandson. And for the first time in human history, we have to recognize that my grandson, whose name is Grant, is not going to have a sustainable, just, and peaceful world unless every child growing up in Botswana, in Bolivia, in Turkey, in Palestine and Israel also has a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. We realize that we are living on a very fragile space station, the Earth. But unlike the space station that our astronauts built, this one doesn't have any shuttles. You can't get off. I can't get off. My grandson won't be able to get off. So we've got to fix it. And for the first time in human history, our geopolitics is truly driven by the corporations. If we go back a few hundred years, we could say that geopolitics was pretty much driven by religious organizations. Christian, Islamic, Jewish, Hindu. And then it was governments. Some were totalitarian, some were democracies, republics. But today, it's the big corporations that call the shots. Nobody gets elected in my country, in the United States, and I don't think in any of the major democracies, unless they get tremendous support from big corporations. The corporations that you people are involved in determining the future of. Corporations control the media. So for most of my lifetime, we could look at the Earth as this big globe with roughly 200 countries, of which a few had a lot of power. The United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, the Ottoman Empire here at one time, the United States. But today, we'd better look at this planet as still this big globe with roughly 200 countries, but the geopolitics might be envisioned as huge clouds drifting around the planet. These are the big corporations. And they have partnerships, they strike deals with the Chinese and the Taiwanese and the Tibetans, with the Palestinians and the Israelis, with the Indians and the Pakistanis. They don't care who's at war with who. And we also have to recognize that these corporations are dependent on you, the investors, and they're also dependent on the consumers. That the marketplace, in fact, is a democracy, if we choose to make it that. That by the way you choose how you place these investments, and by the way consumers choose how they shop, we're casting votes. And it's very important that we recognize that as we move into this future, that we cast those votes toward a world that our children and grandchildren are expecting us to pass on to them. As we know, there's a revolution happening in the world today, too, in terms of our own consciousness. You know, we see the Arab Spring. We see in the United States the Occupy movement. We see demonstrations in Russia, amazing. And throughout Europe, we're seeing tremendous things happening in places like Greece and Spain and Ireland. People rising up, people are understanding. And they're asking us, they're asking you, those who drive the investments, to help create a world that's going to be sustainable. Because we must understand that a species that isn't sustainable goes extinct. We've got to get that. And that we are entering this incredible new time when we're understanding that our resources are diminishing, that we're in crisis, all of us. And it's got to be the private sector, I think, that pulls us out of this. Because it's the private sector, it's the big corporations primarily, that are driving all of this. And you and I know many executives in these corporations. They're good people. They're people that want to create a better world. We need to send an important message to them. So I'd just like to outline a few reasons that what this talk is about, what wrecked our economy and how to fix it. And I think I'd like to focus on 4 areas that have been prime movers in wrecking our economy, in my opinion. And one of those, and this incidentally is discussed in a book I wrote called Hoodwinked, What Wrecked Our Economy and How to Fix It, my most recent book. I think number one is that when I went to business school, I was taught, this was in the 60s, I was taught in business school that a good CEO makes a decent rate of return for his investors and also creates a good environment for his workers, health care, retirement pensions, and has good community relations. Not only pays taxes, but also helps to build schools and things. This was in the 60s. That all began to change in the 70s when I was what was called an economic hitman. My official title was chief economist at a major consulting firm in Boston. But I was really an economic hitman. I'll talk about that in a minute. During the 70s, that changed. Milton Friedman came along with the Chicago School of Economics and said, no, the only responsibility of business is to maximize profits, regardless of social and environmental costs. That was a major change. And I think it's resulted in this world that basically we've created a failed economy. We're not going to go back to normal. Despite what we see, we're going to have fluctuations, but we're not going to go back to normal, and we don't want to. We can't, because normal is a world where, just one example, my country, the United States, less than 5% of the world's population. We consume nearly 30% of the world's resources, while half the world is on the verge of starvation, or actually starving. You can only describe that as a failure. It's not a model. You can't repeat that in China or Africa or Latin America or India. These countries might want to replicate what we've done, but they can't do it. 5% consuming 30% of the world's resources, do the numbers. Can't happen. It's a failed system. So we have to come up with something new. And so what we saw, the first problem, I think, in all of this is this goal that was defined in the 70s by Milton Friedman, the Chicago School of Economics, has been adopted, has been accepted by world leaders across the planet, by business leaders. It isn't working. We need to look at a different issue here. We need to go back to that idea that a good corporation, a good CEO, yes, makes a decent rate of return for his investors, for you guys and your clients, but also does this within the framework of being socially and environmentally responsible, within the framework of creating a world that our children and grandchildren will want to inherit. And number two, I think, in part of the cause is what I would call selling non-beneficial products. And it goes along with this idea of maximizing profits. So we're living in a world today where military is a huge part of the budget. In my country, the United States, it's a huge part of the budget, and all over the world. Killing people, destroying things. It's not exactly good for an active economy. Yes, it may raise GDP figures, but it's not the world that's going to benefit future generations. And second string along there is we produce a lot of things, the famous 1% versus the 99% consume trinkets, things that really are just taking from our children's future, putting them in terrible debt as we move through this time. And so the first one is the goal of maximizing profits regardless of social and environmental costs. Two, non-beneficial products. I think third in here is that we've really had what I would call an imperialistic attitude toward resources, natural and human resources. If we look back at what we used to call the old imperial states, take Spain, for example, back during the years of the Spanish conquest, we all know that Spain basically wrecked its economy because it went and exploited other countries, Latin America and other parts of the world, and didn't really develop itself. Well, today we're in a situation where our corporations and our governments are just constantly exploiting natural resources rather than really looking at where the future is. And in my own job as economic hitman, I'll just describe that a little bit now. I think this really represents it, because my job was to identify countries that had resources that our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to those countries through the World Bank or other financial institutions, but the money never actually went to the countries. Instead, it went to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, power plants, industrial parks, things that benefited the corporations and a few wealthy people in those countries, but didn't help the majority of the people who were too poor to buy electricity, couldn't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people, and yet they were left holding a huge debt that they ultimately couldn't repay, something that we're seeing very similar happening in so many countries in Europe today, this huge debt. And so at some point we'd go back to the country, I'd go back, an economic hitman would go back, and we'd say to the country, hey, since you can't pay your debt, sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies, or whatever the resource was, without any environmental or social regulations or stipulations. Vote with us on the next major United Nations vote. Allow us to build a military base on your soil. These sorts of things. And in the few instances where those countries did not agree, where world leaders did not agree, what we call the jackals stepped in. And these are people who would either overthrow governments or assassinate their leaders. Because I failed with the president of Ecuador, Jaime Roldos, and the head of state of Panama, Omar Torrijos, because they wouldn't buy into this game, this deal that I was offering them, they both were assassinated. And when a few cases when the economic hitmen and the jackals both failed, like with Saddam Hussein, then the military went in. This is a very imperialistic view of the world. It's saying that a few people at the top, a few corporations have the right to exploit these natural and human resources. And it's not the old form of imperialism so much where we always send armies in, it's this new form, but it's not a successful model in the long run. It's not a free market system, even though we may like to call it that. It is not, as you know. And I think the fourth cause of what wrecked our economy is the attitude of consumers and investors that allows us to go on, that says this is all it's about. It's only about making money. It's not about creating a better world for future generations, for ourselves and for future generations. We need to move beyond that. And so, our consumers, and they bought into there's been this promotional, it's a very interconnected system here of what consumers, investors, and the marketing activities. In fact, the consumer has been sending a message, listen, I want cheap jackets, and if they have to be made by slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia, I'll just look the other way. I want cheap petroleum for my cars, and if that means destroying the Amazon rainforest, I'll just look the other way. In other words, if it means passing on a huge, horrible debt to my children and grandchildren, I'll just look the other way. It's a bad attitude. It's not a very human attitude when you come right to it. If you look at human beings throughout history, we've given a tremendous amount of attention to taking care of our children and grandchildren. So how do we fix this economy? And again, I don't think we really want to fix the old economy. We want to create a new economy. And if we start with this idea of goals, I think we redefine what is the goal of a corporation. And the goal, I believe, the new goal should be to maximize profits or return to investors, but only within the context of being socially and environmentally responsible. Let's set some new guidelines here. And I have to say that in my country, in the United States, for the first 100 years, we were a nation. No corporation could get a charter in the United States, in any state, unless it proved that it was going to serve a public interest and would continue to do so. Charters lasted on average for 10 years, and the corporation had to go back and prove that it had served a public interest and would continue to do so. That changed in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court decided corporations had the rights but not the responsibilities of individuals. I think it's a good guiding principle, though. Let corporations serve our interests. And you as investors, invest in those corporations that are going to serve that interest. If we look at history, we see that the people who understand the trends that are coming are the ones that are really successful. So when city-states became nations, a lot of people didn't get it. But the Medici did. They understood that it was not enough to have a bank in Florence. They needed to have one in Venice and Rome and Geneva also. They were tremendously successful. Today's investor, you, needs to see what is the trend in the future. Where do you want to put your money? Where do you want to put your clients' money? You want to put it in those corporations that are going to move into this world that understands that we have to be sustainable. We have to create a just world for all people, a sustainable world. We have to. We're going to move in that direction because there's no other choice ultimately. And I think the second part of this is looking at, what products are we going to create that are beneficial? So how about if we encourage these corporations that you have so much power over to, instead of producing war machines, instead of producing things that kill people, let's direct our energies to cleaning up the polluted environment of our planet, the soils, the water, the earth that's so polluted, and helping starving people around this planet grow food more efficiently, distribute it, store it, distribute it more efficiently. Things that will really create a better planet. Technologies in the area of sustainable energy, in the area of new transportation systems. There's so much that we can do to grow this economy. Yes, this is a time when we need incredible growth, but we need to direct it. You need to direct it toward those areas that are going to sustain us in the long run, because that is the future. There's no question about it. That is the future. And how do we move beyond this item of what I call this imperialistic attitude? I think it's really an understanding more and more that we have to encourage our corporations to really develop good relationships with these other countries, with the resources, with the people in these countries, and the resources in these countries, not continue with the model that I described as the economic hitman model, of basically playing this game of encouraging world leaders to put their resources and their people at risk in the long run. Let our corporations move into new areas. And I think the managers of our corporations, the CEOs and the legal officers at our corporations are in an amazing position to do this. And they want to do it. They're looking for this. They're looking for us to guide them. They're looking for you as investors to guide them. And this takes us into that fourth area of attitudes of investors and consumers. We really must educate ourselves and our consumers, and the investors and the consumers, to understand that we have entered a brand new period in history. This is a revolutionary time. It's an amazing time to be alive. I come from over 300 years of people in the United States. My ancestors fought in the American Revolution. I'm a descendant of Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense, and Ethan Allen, who was in the first victory of the American Revolution. Sorry, you fellows, you Brits. But I used to think, I wish I'd been born in the 1700s so that I could have been part of those times, which seemed so exciting. But now what I realize is this is a much more exciting time. We are truly in a revolution, and you are the driving force behind it. You determine where the money goes, who's going to move forward into this time with success. It's an awesome responsibility that you have. And I know that up until now, the guiding factor primarily has been this idea of maximizing profits. And we can still find fantastic rates of return for our investors. This whole system must be directed toward corporations. Governments aren't going to do it because governments these days are pretty much controlled by corporations. We know that. We know in the United States, Obama has made it very, very clear since he's been elected that he got in there because of corporations and he's going to take care of them. And I think that's wonderful because I trust corporations more than I trust government. And I think that we must guide these corporations, though, you must guide these corporations into the areas that people around the world are expecting us to move into. We are seeing this amazing awakening on this planet. All over this planet, people are saying, we the people. I hate this sort of 1%, 99%. That's a little bit too generalized, too pat. But it's saying that we the people, the majority of us, expect better of those who are controlling the geopolitics of this planet. And those who are controlling the geopolitics are the big corporations, and they're you, the investors. So I encourage you as you launch into this incredible meeting here today and tomorrow to really consider that the best thing you can do for these corporations is also the best thing that you can do for future generations. To really direct these energies, to understand that we must move into this new future. We are at a cusp. We are at a time of history unlike any human beings have ever experienced before. And we don't know what the future is going to look like any more than the Medici did, any more than the people that were going through the industrial or the agricultural revolutions didn't know what the outcome would be. We don't know what the outcome would be, but what we do know is that we must do it differently. The old system is no longer working. We don't want it to work. The corporations are taking control. You have so much control over the corporations. Help guide them in the direction that will make them successful and make this a successful world. And I think it's important to understand the incredible power that each and every one of you has in this room to do that. You have the power. So all it's going to take is the will and the knowledge that we must do this. There is no real alternative. It's not enough to just look at the daily stock market. It's not enough to look at the quarterly profit reports. We must look to the long run, to the trends that we see in the future, waking up to those. And I think it's such an exciting time, and such an exciting time to be amongst you folks and for you to be here together. And as I said, several months ago, I was here in Istanbul speaking to a conference of several thousand heads of the communication industry. I said something similar to them, except what I said to them is, you guys are controlling the communications network, so what is it you want to communicate? And the answer, obviously, is we want to communicate to people that we've got to change our attitudes, that we've got to move into this idea of a sustainable, just, peaceful, thriving world, a world that's thriving for everybody. And they can help to do it through communications, but you are the real key. You're the keystone in the arch because you're the ones who provide the capital, who see where that capital is being directed. This is an amazing time, and I look forward to moving into it with you. And I'd like to leave you with a quote. This is a quote from the Dalai Lama, who is a pretty amazing guy. I happened to have the good fortune of sitting next to him on an airplane flying from from Leh Ladakh into Jammu, India, a few years ago, and then spent some time at his home. And one of the things he pointed out to me was that, actions are terribly important, that it's not enough to just meditate or pray. He's a great spiritual leader who spends a lot of time meditating, but he also spends a tremendous amount of time out in the world talking to people and meeting with people. So it's a combination of bringing that spiritual practice into the practical world. And so the Dalai Lama says, today more than ever before, life must be characterized by a sense of universal responsibility, not only nation to nation and human to human, but also human to other forms of life. It is important to pray and meditate for peace, for a more compassionate and better world, but if that is all that you do, it is a waste of time. You also must take actions to make that happen every single day. And as I look out at you, I realize that you're in a position to take actions every single day by the way you direct the money. How is it going to go? And so I encourage you, and I look forward to moving into this new time with you, to be part of this incredible movement to help my 4-year-old grandson Grant, which means helping every child on this planet, to directing the corporations that you have so much power over, to really creating a sustainable, just, and peaceful world. I look forward to sharing that with you. Thank you very much.